The Way of the Word by William Congreve. Characters, Summary, Analysis. Hello and welcome to the discourse. William Congreve was an English dramatist and poet of the Restoration period. He was known for his satirical dialogue, and he had a great influence on the comedy of manners style that was prominent during that period. However, he rose to the stage at a time when the style of comedy of manners was declining and the public was turning away from the sort of highbrow sexual comedy of manners. It was the period when Jeremy Collier scathingly attacked the Restoration comedies and dramas in general in his pamphlet A Short View of the Immorality and Profaneness of the English Stage. Thomas Rymer was already resisting the comedy of manners with his call for poetic justice. William Congreve gave a lengthy reply to Jeremy Collier in his pamphlet Amendments of Mr. Collier's False and Imperfect Citations, but he did leave the stage. William Congreve studied at Kilkenny College along with Jonathan Swift, who was his classmate. At the age of 17, he moved to London to study law, and during that time, Congreve wrote his first play, Incognita, or Love and Duty Reconciled, which was published in 1692 under the pseudonym Cleophile. That won him praise from literary critics, including John Dryden, who became his mentor. In 1693, Congreve's first play, The Old Bachelor, was performed, and John Dryden promoted it as a brilliant first piece. It was a comedy of manners. His other plays include The Double Dealer 1694 and Love for Love 1695, which were both comedies, and The Mourning Bride, which was a tragedy, was first performed in 1697. Congreve's last play was performed in Lincoln's Inn Fields in 1700, and it was titled The Way of the Word. The play didn't succeed at that time. It was one of the last comedies of manners of the Restoration period. However, the play proved to be an important one later on. George Farquhar raised the issue of women trapped in abusive wedlock in his play The Bow Stratagem, in which he devised a way to offer monetary support for the divorcing wife Kate Sullen. John Vanbrugh also raised the issue of women trapped in abusive marriages in his plays The Relapse or Virtue in Danger and The Provoked Wife. William Congreve also mentioned the troubles of a mismatched marriage and the issue of the property rights of a woman. One of the major themes of The Way of the Word is inheritance and a woman's right to her parents' property. As the title suggests, The Way of the Word is a satirical comedic commentary on the then society and norms of England. Characters of The Way of the Word. Mr. Fennel is a married man who married Mrs. Arabella Fennel, who was a widow, for the money that she inherits from her late husband and her mother, Lady Wishford. He is a greedy person who was already in a relationship with Mrs. Marwood before his marriage to Mrs. Arabella. Mrs. Marwood continues to be his mistress, as his only intention to marry Mrs. Fennel is her money. Mrs. Arabella Fennel, on the other hand, was in love with Mr. Edward Mirabell, who once was a womanizer but now has changed. Mr. Mirabell isn't of a wealthy background. He helped Arabella and Lady Wishford in engineering Arabella's marriage to Mr. Fennel to protect Arabella from scandal in the event of pregnancy. However, Arabella didn't get pregnant. Arabella and Mirabell are now friends, while Mirabell fell in love with Miss Millamant, who is a niece and ward of Lady Wishford, cousin of Mrs. Arabella Fennel. Miss Millamant has a huge inheritance of £12,000, but she holds only £6,000 of it, while the remaining £6,000 are in the custody of Lady Wishford. Lady Wishford doesn't approve of her marriage to Mirabell and wants her to marry Sir Wilful Whitwood, who is a nephew of Lady Wishford. He is an inept, bumbling man who tries to pursue Miss Millamant romantically. His half-brother, Anthony Whitwood, is also a suitor of Miss Millamant. Waitwell is a servant of Mirabell who marries Foible, a servant of Lady Wishford, without her knowledge. Later on, Mirabell and Miss Millamant devise a plan to project Waitwell as Sir Rowland, an uncle of Mirabell, who will woo and propose to Lady Wishford to marry him, and then lead situations to convince Lady Wishford that Mirabell is the best man for Miss Millamant. Foible is aware of his plan. Lady Wishfort is uncomfortable with her age and looks, and this allows Mirabel's plot with the fake Sir Rowland to succeed as far as it does. Summary of The Way of the Word. The Way of the Word is a 5-act play. The background of the play is that Mirabel, a young, handsome but poor man, used to be a womanizer who got into an affair with a rich widow named Arabella. However, Arabella's mother, Lady Wishfort, didn't approve of his marriage to Arabella because of his poor background. To protect Arabella from any scandal because of his affair with her, he helped Lady Wishfort to arrange the marriage of Arabella with Mr. Fennel, who is a reputed but greedy and corrupt person. He marries the widow Arabella only for the fortune of Arabella that he needs to finance his affair with Mrs. Marwood. Meanwhile, Mirabel changed as a person and puts an end to his affair with Arabella, while he remained her well-wisher and a close friend. Later on, he falls in love with Arabella's cousin Miss Millamant, who is the niece of Lady Wishfort. Miss Millamant loves Mirabel and wishes to marry him. She has a huge inheritance of £12,000, but half of it is in the custody of Lady Wishfort, who is completely against her marriage with Mirabel. Lady Wishfort wants Millamant to marry Sir Wilful Whitwood, whom Miss Millamant finds inept and undeserving. Lady Wishfort is aging, but she still believes that she is very attractive. Mirabel had earlier offended Lady Wishfort. She had misinterpreted his flattery as love. Mirabel and Miss Millamant devise a plan to save her inheritance while they get married, and for this, Mirabel takes help of his servant Waitwell. They plan to introduce Waitwell as Sir Rowland, an uncle of Mirabel. As Mirabel knows that Lady Wishful has the desire to fall in love and get married, he plans to fake Uncle Sir Rowland to woo and win Lady Wishfort's love. Then Mirabel will reveal the reality of Sir Rowland to save Lady Wishfort, and in response will get the approval of Lady Wishfort for his marriage to Millamant. To make their plan foolproof, they arrange the marriage of Waitwell to Foible before he pretends to Sir Rowland, so that he may not be able to trap Lady Wishfort to his contract. Thus, Waitwell is secretly married to Foible without Lady Wishfort's knowledge, and Foible becomes a part of the plan. As Waitwell is already married to Foible, his fake marriage to Lady Wishfort will be illegal and will be nullified. The play begins as Mirabel is playing cards with Mr. Fennel. Mr. Fennel isn't happy with Mirabel as he knows that he has tricked him twice. He suspects that his wife, Mrs. Fennel, is a former mistress of Mirabel. The more troubling fact is that Mrs. Marwood, who is Mr. Fennel's mistress, appears to be more interested in Mirabel. Mrs. Marwood wishes to marry Mirabel as Mr. Fennel is already married to Arabella. Thus, Mr. Fennel has been stung by Mirabel twice. Meanwhile, Miss Millamant is in true love with Mirabel, but playfully teases him while their marriage is uncertain. Mirabel is nervous about his plan, but it is going well. Foible and Waitwell are now married, and Waitwell has taken the disguise of Sir Rowland to woo Lady Wishfort. Meanwhile, Mrs. Marwood is flirting with Mirabel, and as he goes away to confirm the marriage of Foible with Waitwell, she follows him. Accidentally, she overhears the conversation between Mrs. Fennel and Foible as they discuss the former love affair between Mirabel and Mrs. Fennel, as well as his current plan of marrying Miss Millamant. Furthermore, she also overhears Mrs. Fennel cursing her as Mr. Fennel wastes her money on his mistress. Foible also makes fun of Mrs. Marwood by commenting on how she is trying to woo Mirabel. This makes Mrs. Marwood vengeful against Mirabel, as she now knows that she cannot catch him. She goes back to Mr. Fennel and tells him about Mirabel's plan. She further reveals that his wife used to be a lover of Mirabel. Mr. Fennel gets enraged, but instead of acting rashly, he along with Mrs. Marwood devised their own conspiracy to gain the most profit out of the situation. Meanwhile, Mirabel introduces Sir Rowland to Lady Wishfort as his uncle, and Sir Rowland soon starts flattering and flirting with Lady Wishfort, who again feels her desire to get in love rekindle. On the other hand, Miss Millamant declares that she will marry Mirabel and rejects Sir Wilful Whitwood's proposal. Mr. Fennel then comes into action as he catches Sir Rowland and unmasks him as Waitwell, a servant of Mirabell. He then blackmails Lady Wishford with the threat of ruining her and her daughter's reputation. He says that since Millamant has decided to marry Mirabell by rejecting Sir Wilful Witwoud, her balanced fortune controlled by Lady Wishford should be forfeited and transferred to him. He further demands that Lady Wishford should assure him that she will never marry and hence he will remain the sole heir of his wife's property. When Miss Millamant listens to all this, she decides to save her balance of inheritance controlled by Lady Wishford and changes her decision and declares that she will marry Sir Wilful Witwoud. This ruins Miss Fennel's plan. Yet he continues to press that Lady Wishford should immediately hand over all his wife's property to him and should declare him the caretaker of her wealth too. Mirabell tries to dissuade the situation and put some pressure on Mr. Fennel by bringing Waitwell and Foible up front as witnesses of Mr. Fennel and Mrs. Marwood's extramarital affair. He brazenly ignores it and asserts that he will still drag Mrs. Fennel's name in scandal and ruin Lady Wishford's reputation. Now is the time for Mirabell to reveal his trump card. He says that he and Arabella always knew that Mr. Fennel is a corrupt, greedy person, and hence, to protect herself, Arabella appointed Mirabell as the trustee of her fortune much before her marriage to Mr. Fennel. Thus, Mr. Fennel has no claim on her fortune, nor Lady Wishford can offer it to Mr. Fennel, as Mirabell holds that right. Mr. Fennel is now completely defeated, as neither Mrs. Fennel nor Lady Wishford controls their money, and he cannot put any pressure on Mirabell. He is very angry and frustrated and decides to go away with Mrs. Marwood. Meanwhile, Sir Wilful Witwoud takes his proposal to marry Millamant back and claims that Mirabell deserves her. Lady Wishford is also convinced that Mirabell will take good care of Millamant like he saved her and her daughter Arabella's fortune. She forgives the servants and offers her wishes to Foible and Waitwell for their married life and agrees to offer her consent for the marriage of Mirabell and Millamant. The play ends in reconciliation as Mirabell and Millamant conciliate despite Millamant giving up her love to save her fortune. Sir Wilful Witwoud also forgives Millamant, while Lady Wishford forgives Mirabell, Waitwell, Foible and Arabella for fooling her around. The theme of the play includes fashion, courtship, seduction, property rights and women's rights to their inheritance in marriage. William Congreve was known for witty and intelligent dialogues in his plays. One of the famous dialogue from The Way of the Word is, "One's cruelty is one's power, and then one parts with one's cruelty, one parts with one's power. And when one has parted with that, I fancy one's old and ugly." While this quote is said by Millamant, it shows the fear of Lady Wishford, who is losing her power, her cruelty, her strength, and becoming old and helpless, which makes her desperate to be confirmed as beautiful and powerful. Just like George Farquhar's Kate Sullen from The Bow Stratagem, William Congreve's Arabella also saves her fortune despite getting divorced or separated from their husband. So this is it for today. We will continue to discuss the history of English literature. Please stay connected with the discourse. Thanks and regards.